Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the Russian economy, and specifically to talk about changes that Russia have now proposed to the taxation system around the exit of Western businesses. Now, without a shadow of a doubt, one of the worst investment decisions you could have made over the past 30 years if you were running a business was to go and set up a facility in Russia. And following the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, Russia needed help. It wanted companies from the West to go to Russia to help them to develop its industries. And thousands of businesses saw this as a fantastic opportunity, not just to go and access the market, but also to develop joint ventures and to expand all across Eastern Europe. And we saw some major multinationals such as BP, Shell, ExxonMobil, Ford, PepsiCo, and many others going and setting up factories, actually investing hundreds of millions and in some cases billions of dollars into the Russian market. And for around 10 or 15 years, that went really well. Some of those businesses started to make profit. But obviously, if you're investing over $1 billion, it's a long-term play. When you're working in the oil and gas industry, for example, like companies like ExxonMobil and BP and Shell, you're investing for the long term. The payback period on many of those investments would be 20, 30 or even 50 years. So you're looking at the long game. You want that long-term annuity as you sell lots of oil over a very long period of time. But unfortunately, on the 24th of February 2022, things changed forever because that was the day when Russia decided to invade Ukraine. And many of those big multinationals came out and said that they no longer wanted to deal with Russia, they weren't going to invest any further, and that they wanted to exit the country. And over the last 2.5 years, we've seen lots of different businesses leaving Russia. However, it hasn't been an easy process, and the Russian authorities saw this as a great opportunity to actually make some money both for Russia and also for the Kremlin. So they introduced exit controls in terms of how much each of those companies was allowed to sell their business for and how much tax they had to pay. They also introduced a variety of nationalizations. These are businesses that the Russian state considered to be critical to Russian infrastructure, and so they just seized those assets. The previous owners didn't receive any payment whatsoever, and the state took a nice piece of tax on top of that. And in this video, what I want to talk about is some changes that have now been proposed by the Kremlin relating to that exit process and the nationalizations. Because these changes tell us that the Russian state is now struggling for revenue and it's having to get a bigger piece of the pie just to keep things going. So we'll go through exactly what the exit process looks like and also what's happened with regards to nationalizations. We'll take a look at those new proposed changes in the tax rules. We'll also have a look at which companies have been the biggest losers so far in terms of the businesses that they've had to walk away from. And then finally today, I'll wrap up with my summary as to what I think is going on right now, why the Kremlin is introducing these tax changes, and what's likely to happen over the course of the next 6 to 12 months. But before we get started on all of that, first of all, I'd like to say, if you're a regular viewer but you haven't subscribed yet, could you please hit the subscribe button, because I'm trying to get to 400,000 subscribers. I'm a little way away at the moment, and it's quite slow in terms of the progress. So if you have watched regularly and you haven't subscribed, please do so. And I'd also like to say thank you so much to everyone that's supporting the channel. If you're a long-term supporter, either through Patreon or YouTube membership, where you can get early access to my videos, or buy me a coffee membership, which is great, I really appreciate that. Thank you so much for that long-term support. And if you've bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks recently, thank you so much for the time and the effort and the generosity. It really means a lot to me. Now, just before we go on any further today, I want to talk to you about today's sponsor, NordVPN, who I use on a daily basis, and who are offering Joe Blogs viewers an exclusive deal. In today's modern connected world, we are all more and more dependent on online activities. And unfortunately, cybercrime is a growing threat. In fact, it's happening on a daily basis. And if you follow the channel, you'll know that I personally have been a victim of cybercrime when this channel was hacked and taken over by cyber criminals. And if you want to avoid you and your finances being hacked by cyber criminals, then you should start using NordVPN. By using NordVPN, every time you log on, you'll be protected from all sorts of criminal activity. And don't override it like I did and expose yourself to a hacking incident. So the great news is that NordVPN will protect you every single time you go online. But it's also great because it offers you a whole new world of opportunities. Now, I'm constantly doing research for all of my different articles, and I find that sometimes I'm geo-blocked. I can't actually access the information because I'm in the wrong country. However, by using NordVPN, you'll be able to access data, information, TV shows, movies, and sports matches that are not available in your region. And the great news is that Joe Blogs viewers are being offered an exclusive deal, which you can access by clicking in the link below. And the great news is that it offers a 30-day money-back guarantee. So if you're not happy, you can get your money back within the first 30 days. Following the invasion of Ukraine, a wave of companies came out and said that they were exiting Russia. And in response to that, Russia announced that it was going to introduce a 10% exit tax on any company that sold its business in Russia. So Russia wanted to make sure that it got a piece of the action when these companies were actually exiting Russia, despite the fact that this was actually a positive in terms of the Russian businesses that were able to buy those assets. However, what you need to think about in terms of that exit value is that when you've got a market that is severely diminished, you don't really have many options. There are not many buyers. It's like you trying to sell your house when nobody wants to buy it at all. If there's no buyers, then the value of your house just has to keep going down and down and down until you find somebody who's prepared to pay something for it. And that's exactly what happened in Russia. And many of the companies announced that they were going to have to write off billions of dollars. And we'll talk about that later in the video, exactly who made the biggest losses. So we had a diminished market and falling values and a 10% tax. But actually things got worse than that because the Kremlin decided that the 10% tax wasn't good enough and that those overseas companies could only sell their businesses for a maximum of 50% of the market value. So the market value had already gone down because there were very few buyers. And then even if you could find a buyer, the Kremlin then said, okay, you can only sell it for half the price. So this obviously wasn't a great deal, but from a political point of view, many of the Western companies had already committed to exiting Russia, and so it was genuinely a buyer's market from the Russian businesses side of things. And then in October 2023, around 6 months after the initial announcement, the Kremlin decided that 10% wasn't enough and that they were going to increase the exit tax to 15%. And I think what that shows is that the Kremlin was struggling for cash flow. It needed to find as much tax as it could, and this was low-hanging fruit from their point of view. You're not going to worry about upsetting exiting companies because they're never coming back to Russia. So it's easier to increase that tax than it is to increase income taxes, for example. And it's now been announced that the Russian authorities have decided to increase the exit tax to 40%. So basically, if you're a company looking to exit Russia, firstly, you have to find a buyer, unless you want to walk away from your assets and just write off 100% of your investment. If you do manage to find a buyer, and let's face it, that buyer will be Russian, it'll be one of the Russian oligarchs because they're the only people who have this sort of money to buy businesses. Then they set a price, and that's obviously going to be a lot less than you'd get in an open market if Russia wasn't hit with heavy sanctions. So you're already dealing with a much lower value than the real value. You then have to apply a 50% discount against that value, so you only get 50% of what you were originally going to get, and then when you get that money, you have to pay 40% of it to the Russian state as a tax. So in terms of what you end up with, it's a lot less than what that business is worth and considerably less than what you've invested. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, but surely haven't all of the companies that were operating in Russia already left? Surely there's nothing left. But you'd be surprised that there are still hundreds of companies from the West that are still operating as normal within Russia. And the Yale School of Management has put together a comprehensive list of all of the companies that have left, some of the companies that have downscaled their operations, and those who are left behind. According to the latest list, Yale believe that 213 companies are still operating as normal within Russia, despite Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the significant sanctions against Russia. And if you're interested in checking out that full list, then have a look at the link that I've attached to this video below. And it was recently reported that the budget contribution from foreign company exit deals in the first 8 months of 2024 were 140 billion rubles, which is the equivalent of around $1.5 billion. So still a significant amount of income is being received by the Kremlin for companies leaving Russia. Now, as I said at the start of today's video, alongside all of the companies from the West who are looking to sell their businesses to try and recoup some of the investment, Some businesses didn't have that choice because the Russian state decided that their assets were in the national interest of security and therefore should be nationalized. So they had their assets taken away from them, seized by the state, and received absolutely no reimbursement whatsoever. In 2023, more than 1 trillion rubles, which equates to over $11 billion, worth of strategic enterprises and assets were transferred to state ownership by Russian courts. According to the Russian prosecutor's office, these assets were critical for developing Russia's economy and strengthening its defence capabilities. And in terms of justifying the seizure of these assets, the Prosecutor General, Igor Krasnov, told Putin in a televised address to a prosecution service conference that the assets had been taken out of the ownership of the Russian Federation by illegal, including corrupt means. Moreover, some of their funds were even being directed to finance terrorist activities on the part of Ukraine, he said. In response to these seizures, the Bank of Russia Governor Elvira Nabiullina expressed concerns that retail investors were being forced to give up shares they'd bought on the market. If we want to attract resources for development, including using capital market opportunities, then of course maintaining trust is super important, she said. Now, obviously, the seizure of overseas businesses for the Russian state is good news for Russia because it gives them access to all of that cash flow and all of the value of that business. However, the Kremlin has now decided that that isn't good enough and that they now want to tax these seizures. Russia's government has proposed ordering state companies that acquire assets and property through court decisions to pay 50% of the asset's market value to the federal budget. In 2023, $10.5 billion worth of strategic enterprises and assets, seen as critical for developing Russia's economy and defence capabilities, were transferred to state ownership by Russian courts. And therefore, in terms of calculating how much this 50% tax would generate, in 2023 it would have generated $5.27 billion for the Kremlin. So as I said at the start of today's video, the fact that the Kremlin is having to ramp up its taxation system, it's now trying to take even more value out of these assets, tells us that the Kremlin is running short of funds and it's now having to desperately look around to see where it can get more taxation revenue from. So let's have a look at how much Western businesses have lost so far in terms of the assets that they've had to walk away from in Russia. BP is the company that has incurred the single biggest loss as part of their full exit out of Russia and declared a write-down of $24 billion relating to its stakes in Rosneft and two other joint ventures in Russia. The company that's incurred the second biggest loss in the world is the French business Total Energies and has recorded impairment costs of $10.7 billion. Shell, which is the world's largest trader of liquefied natural gas, and had been involved in a joint venture facility on the island of Sakhalin with Russia, have written off $5 billion of investment as a result of their decision to fully exit from Russia. ExxonMobil, the giant US oil business, was one of the first to develop a joint venture in Russia and has disclosed a $3.4 billion write-down relating to its full exit from the country. German energy business Uniper owned and operated 5 power plants in Russia, and despite the fact that Germany is at the forefront of the sanctions against Russia, the company continued to operate these plants until President Putin issued a decree seizing all of the assets for the Russian state, and as a result of this, Uniper incurred a write-off of $5 billion. Finnish energy business Fortum owned and operated 7 thermal power plants in Russia, as well as a variety of wind and solar plants. The company was in the process of organising a controlled exit by selling these operations to a Russian business. However, this sale process was upended when President Putin issued a decree seizing control of all of the assets, and as a result of this, Fortum incurred a write-off of $2 billion. OMV, the Austrian energy business, has taken a €2 billion hit on its decision to exit. The Norwegian business Equinor has shut all its facilities, incurring a loss of $1.1 billion, and Enel, the Italian utility business, sold its 56% stake in Enel Russia for around €137 million, incurring a loss of €1.3 billion. The French bank Société Générale had the largest exposure as a result of its ownership of Russian bank Rosbank. Directly following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, SocGen started the process of selling this stake, and it was sold to a Russian oligarch, and SocGen incurred a loss of €3.2 billion on the deal. Italian bank Unicredit had the second largest exposure to the Russian market, and so far has booked a €1.3 billion loss relating to all of the loans that it currently has out to Russian companies and individuals. French bank Crédit Agricole had the third largest exposure and has taken a hit of €500 million. Austrian bank Raiffeisen International had a variety of branches and so far has taken a hit of €301 million. Italian insurer Generali also had large exposure and so far has taken a hit of €138 million. American bank Citigroup had developed a commercial and consumer banking business in Russia over the course of the last 20 years and so far has incurred charges of $170 million relating to that exposure. And Swiss banking giant UBS has so far written off $100 million and so far has reduced its loan exposure from $600 million to $400 million. Over the last 20 years or so, McDonald's had built an extensive network of stores in Russia. However, McDonald's has taken the decision to exit entirely from Russia and has sold all of its stores to a Russian business who has had to rebrand it and is not allowed to use the McDonald's name. And as part of that deal, McDonald's have incurred a loss of $1.4 billion. AB InBev, the large Belgian brewer, had a non-controlling stake in a Russian joint venture and has written off $1.1 billion as part of its exit. Carlsberg, the Danish brewer, had 8 breweries and 8,400 employees in Russia and was in the process of selling this to a Russian business when President Putin issued a decree seizing all of the assets from the company for no value. And as a result of this action, Carlsberg incurred a write-off of $1.4 billion. Danone, the French food manufacturer, which had an extensive dairy products business and also an infant milk business in Russia, was in the process of selling this to a Russian buyer when President Putin issued a decree seizing all of the assets for Russian ownership, and as a result of this, Danone incurred a write-off of $1 billion. Heineken, the world's second largest brewer, had 7 breweries and 1,800 employees in Russia, but sold these operations to a Russian business for a token value of €1, incurring a loss of $325 million. US tobacco giant Philip Morris has discontinued sales of a number of Marlboro and Parliament cigarette products in Russia and has taken a hit of over $1 billion. Henkel, the makers of a number of consumer products, including Persil washing detergent and Pritt glue, has also incurred a write-off of €1 billion as part of its exit from the country. French car maker Renault had set up its own facilities in Russia and also had a majority stake in Russia's biggest car maker AutoVAZ. As a result of the invasion of Ukraine, Renault has now exited from the country and sold its stake in AutoVAZ for €1 ruble, incurring a loss of €867 million in the year. Nissan, the Japanese car company, had also set up facilities in Russia. However, they have now sold this for €1 to a Russian state-owned entity, incurring a loss of $687 million. Volkswagen, the German car business, had set up a truck division under its Traton brand and have now disposed of this, incurring a loss of €550 million. Volvo, the Swedish car manufacturer, had a factory in the southeast of Moscow that produced around 3,000 vehicles annually. And when this was sold to a Russian business, the company wrote down the full amount of its investment of around $860 million. Ford had a 49% stake in the Russian-based Solarz Ford joint venture, which in 2021 sold around 20,000 vehicles in Russia. However, the stake has now been sold in Russia and Ford have fully exited the market, taking a $122 million write-down. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think the news that the Kremlin is ramping up the taxes relating to the exit of Western businesses is really interesting because it tells us a couple of things. Firstly, with regards to those exit, it tells us that Russia is dead as an international entity. Multinational companies went there in the 1990s to develop their businesses, to help develop joint ventures alongside Russian entrepreneurs and Russian businessmen to try to help them with their skills, develop all of their potential, and to access a 145 million people market. So it was a win-win situation for all of those businesses. They went in, they got some new customers, they could expand their opportunities, and they could work with local people. So from Russia's point of view, it was great news. However, the invasion of Ukraine has changed that landscape forever, because we've seen a lot of those businesses walk away from their investments. Billions of dollars in many cases. We're talking huge amounts of infrastructure, lots of people being transferred to Russia, taking their know-how and their experience to be able to build these new facilities with them. And so Russia integrated itself for a while, but it's now completely exited. And I don't think any of those multinational businesses will show any interest in going back to Russia. Even if the war in Ukraine stopped tomorrow and Russia said, we're sorry, we'd like to apologise, can everybody please come back and start again? I don't think any of the Western businesses would want to do that. Firstly, there's the political implications. Obviously, nobody wants to see a war. But secondly, there's the logic of, would you ever put another cent of investment into a country that's turned around and said, we're seizing all of your assets? And if you want to sell your assets, then these are the terms that we're prepared to offer you. Firstly, you can only sell it to a Russian, so that obviously restricts the market hugely. Secondly, Russia's currently under a huge amount of sanctions, so the value of your business has already gone down because it's based in Russia. Thirdly, if you do find a buyer, you're only allowed to accept 50% of the value that they're offering you, so you have to cut the price again in half. And then once you've actually completed that sale, we now want to take 40% of those proceeds as a tax. So all of that is obviously horrible news for the people who are selling, but great news for Russia because they're getting these businesses for a song and the Kremlin's taking a big slice of tax on top. So I don't think anybody will want to go back to Russia. But even the countries that don't have a political issue with Russia, such as China and India, will be looking at this situation and thinking, do we want to go and set up businesses in Russia? And I think the simple answer to that is probably not, because you'd be insane to do so, because the Russian authorities have shown that they don't care about relationships. They don't care about long-term joint ventures. All they care about is what's going on in Russia and the Russian coffers. So if they want to take your business, if they decide that that's the right thing to do in terms of boosting their own revenue, boosting their own business, then they will do that. So I don't think Chinese businesses will want to invest. Indian businesses definitely won't. And so Russia is really going to struggle to be able to develop its industries, because it's not just the capital, it's also the expertise and the know-how. We've talked about this a lot on the channel. But in the oil and gas industry, you need to have the latest cutting-edge technology, the latest ideas, particularly in Russia, because a lot of their oil fields are in inhospitable places that have really cold climates. So there's a lot of problems that you need to get around when you're bringing oil to the surface. And the fact that all of these experts have left Russia and they don't want to share any of their knowledge with Russian businesses is going to prove a problem for Russia. They're now working in isolation, and that's not how the world works. If you want to get the best out of your business, you need to look around and see what everybody else is doing, share your knowledge, share your practices, learn from other people, and then you can develop to be the best in the world. Doing it in isolation is really difficult, and Russia is going to struggle from that perspective. But the other thing that we've talked about in today's video is the fact that the Kremlin is now racking up the taxes in respect of those businesses that are leaving and also those assets that have been seized. And what that tells us is that Russia is desperately running short of cash. If you need to raise your taxes, that's because you need more money. That's basic economics. When a new government takes over, quite often they blame the old government for what's been going on. That's happening in the UK right now. There's been a change of government between Conservatives and Labour. Labour are now saying Conservatives have blown the budget. There's black holes all over the place. And so we're going to have to increase taxes. And obviously, nobody really wants to pay more tax because that means that you'll have less cash. And from a personal point of view, that's bad news. So the announcement of new taxes is always received quite poorly. So if you can tax somebody else, if you can tax overseas companies that are leaving Russia, if you can rack those taxes up, then politically that's more acceptable, because in Russia nobody really cares that you're taking money off companies like Carlsberg and Danone. However, the reason that you're doing that is because you're short of money, and that's what's going on in Russia right now. They wouldn't be increasing all of these taxes if they didn't need the cash. And the fact that they're now announcing a 50% tax on the assets that have been nationalized, what they're saying is, okay, we will give those assets to a Russian business because that's in the interest of Russia from a wider perspective. However, that business is then going to have to pay us 50% of the value in cash. And from a cash flow point of view, that can be quite challenging because assets and cash are two different things. If you're running a business and somebody hands you a factory and says this factory is worth $100 million, you might say, well, fantastic, I've just inherited $100 million worth of assets. But if they then turn around and say, and you owe us 50% of that, so you have to pay us $50 million in cash, you might not have that cash. Having the assets and not having the cash means that you're then in an illiquid situation. And the Russian state could actually start suing these Russian businesses for the money if they don't pay up. So this actually could cause some quite big issues in terms of the operations for those companies and also the cash flow, because you don't want to hand over a large chunk of cash, because those assets may take 3 or 5 years to actually generate that amount of cash so that you can break even on a cash flow basis. So the overall summary of today's video is that the Kremlin has now announced an increase in taxes for companies leaving Russia and also assets that are being seized. The reason that they're doing that is because the Kremlin is under increasing pressure in terms of cash flow. I've talked about this in other videos. That's one of the reasons why the ruble is falling in value at the moment, because the Russian central bank doesn't have enough money to keep supporting it. So the Russian authorities are running short of cash. They're trying desperately to come up with more ideas to bring more cash in. They've decided that these taxes are an easy win. However, I don't think it will bring in a huge amount of money. It's not going to solve the problem. And so the problems in the Russian economy continue to go on, and I'll give you an update as soon as I get any further news on anything like this. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video. You found it useful, informative, and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.
So the guys have got a bit of a problem here, and the elephants are coming and helping themselves, taking advantage.